Shalom, everybody. We're now going to continue Malachim Beis. We're up to Perek Yud Daled, and we are now going to switch from Malchei Yisrael to Malchei Yehuda. We were discussing Yoash, the son of Yehoachaz Melech Yisrael, and it ends with his dying. But Bishnash Shtayim LiYoash ben Yehoachaz Melech Yisrael, in the second year of the reign of Yoash ben Yehoachaz Melech Yisrael, there was a change in Malchus Yehuda. Malach Amatziyahu ben Yoash Melech Yehuda ben Esrim b'Chamei Shan Haya b'Malchai. Amatziyahu was 25 years old when he became king. V'Yesrim b'Teisha Shana Malach b'Yushalayim. He ruled for 29 years in Yerushalayim. He was the son of Yoash. V'Shem Imai Yehoadan min Yerushalayim. And his mother was Yehoadan from Yerushalayim. It's interesting that the Gemara in Megillah tells us Amitz and Amatzia were brothers. So Yeshayahu ben Amitz was a nephew of this king Amatzia. And the Gemara in Megillah learns from here that if a kala, if a daughter-in-law is sanua, even when she's with her father-in-law, she is zeicha to have neviim and malachim, and that's Tamar. Yehuda didn't recognize Tamar when she pretended to be a prostitute because she was sanua bebeis chamia. So Memela, in the merit of Tamar's Sinias, she was Zeicha to have kings. Of course, it's many kings, really. All of Malchus Beis David comes from Tamar. It's not just Amatzia. Malachim and Nevi'im is Yeshayahu ben Amitz, because Amitz and Amatzia were brothers. Okay. And here Amatzia is a righteous king. V'yasa Yasher b'nei Hashem. Amatzia did upright in the eyes of Hashem. Rak like David Aviv, but he was not like David, meaning he was not totally shalom. We'll see in a moment. Kechayel asher asa Yoash aviv asa. He was a tzaddik just like Yoash, his father was a tzaddik. Rak habamais leisaru. The one avla was that Yoash and Amatzia eradicated avodah zarah, but they could not stop the people from the private bamais that they brought Lashem. Remember, when there's a Beis HaMikdash, you're not allowed to have bamais even to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but he could not stop people from doing it. Od ha'am mizabchim umekatrim babamot. People were still slaughtering korbanos and burning them on the bamais. This was for Hashem, but it was an Isser D'Oraisa of Shechutei Chutz. Vayehi, kasher chaska mamlacha biyadai, when the kingdom was very strong in his hand, when he was secure in his kingdom, vayach es avadav hamakim es hamelech aviv. If you remember, Yoash was actually assassinated by his own servants. And initially, Amatzia could not take action against them. He did not feel secure enough. But when he felt he had support, he killed all of the avadim who killed his father. But it mentions that in spite of the fact that in those days collective guilt was common, es b'nei hamakim lo hemis. He killed the murderers, and even without hasra, this is mishpat hamelech, mayred b'malchus, it could be killed by the melech without edom b'hasra, but he did not kill the children of the murderers, because he followed the principle of the Torah itself. Kakosav b'sefer Torahs Moshe, as it is written in the Sefer of the Torah of Moshe, Asher Tziva Hashem Lemor, that the Eibusher commanded, and this quotes a pasuk, Lo yumsu avais albanim, that fathers shall not be put to death for the sin of their children, ubanim lo yumsu al avais, and children shall not be put to death for the sin of their fathers, ki em ish b'chetai yumas. Excuse me, a person dies only because of his own sin. Because Amatzia was a tzaddik, he was makayim this halacha. So that's one thing that he did. Second accomplishment of Amatzia, hu hika es edaim begay melech aseres alafim. that he waged war against Edom. Edom had been conquered by David HaMelech, but then they rebelled. Amaziah was able to reclaim the land of Edom, fighting in the valley around the Dead Sea, the Yam HaMelech, and he killed 10,000 Edomites. V'tafas es hasela b'milchama, and he was able to conquer certain territory that was called Selat, was like a rocky territory. Vayikra es shema Yoksael, and it was given the name Yoksael ad hayom hazeh, and that is its name even to the present time when this book was written. So two things that he did. Number one, he eradicated the Rishayim that had murdered his father. Number two, he waged war successfully against Edom and conquered Edomite territory. Now number three, Oz shalach Amaziah malachim el Yehoash ben Yehoachaz ben Yehu melech Yisrael. Amaziah then sent shluchim to Yoash ben Yehoachaz, son of Yehu melech Yisrael, Lemor lecha nisra'eh panim. Let us meet each other, meaning I'm threatening you in war, right? We mentioned before that Amaziah had a war with Yehoash, and Amaziah wants to wage war, and the reason is because there was certain territory that belonged to Yehuda that Malchi Yisrael had taken. Vayishlach Yehoash melech Yisrael el Amaziah melech Yehuda lemor. Yehoash melech Yisrael sent a message back to Amaziah melech Yehuda, saying, "Don't mess with me. My nation is much bigger and stronger than yours. I have 10 tribes. You only have 2 tribes. Hachayach asher balavanan shalach el ha'eres asher balavanan lemor tana es bitcha livni leisha." He gives a mashal. A thorn, an insignificant little thorn in Lebanon, sends a message to the big and powerful cedar of Lebanon, "I want your daughter for my son." What a chutzpah. This little thorn says to the big tree, "Give me your daughter." And what happens? Vatavor chayas hasada asher balavanan. The wild animals in the Lebanon that eat thorns, or step on them, vatirmos es achayach. It simply steps on the thorn and crushes it. Hakei hikisa es Edom, just because you were victorious over the Edomites, Bnei Esav, unesoacha libecha. Now you're a Baal Gaiva, right? You think you beat Esav, so you can beat me. He kabed. If you want to preserve your honor, v'shei b'veisecha. Just sit at home. Meaning, don't you even think about fighting me. Lama tiskare bara. Why should you enmesh yourself in something that's only going to end badly? V'nafalta atav Yehuda imach. And you will be killed. And your whole nation of Yehuda will be defeated. But v'loi shama Amaziah. Amaziah did not listen. Vayal Yehoash melech Yisrael v'yisru panim. Hu v'Amaziah melech. The 2 kings were fighting a war in Beit Shemesh, which is near Yerushalayim. This is really the same place as modern Beit Shemesh, which is in the Chelek of Yehuda. And unfortunately, Amaziah was not zeicha to a bracha here. Vayinagef Yehuda lifnei Yisrael. Yehuda was smitten in front of the 10 tribes. V'yanusu ish li'olav, and everybody fled. Retreat. V'yes Amaziah melech Yehuda ben Yoash ben Achaziah tafas Yehoash melech Yisrael b'Beit Shemesh. And Amaziah, the melech Yehuda, was seized, was captured by Yehoash melech Yisrael. Vayavai Yerushalayim, and then Yehoash actually came to Yerushalayim. Vayifraitz b'chaimas Yerushalayim b'shar Ephraim ad shar Apina arba me'ais ama. And what Yehoash Melech Yisrael did was, he made a breach in the wall of Yerushalayim, which was a walled city, from, again, these are gates, we don't really know where they are. There was a gate that was called the Gate of Ephraim, and there was a gate that was called Sharapina, the Gate of a Corner, and the distance between the two gates was 400 amas. An amma is either 1.5 or 2 feet, and he simply breached the wall for a shetach of 400 amas. So he was able to go in. V'lokach es kol hazohav v'hakesef v'yes kol hakelim hanimtzayim beis Hashem u'v'yotzreis beis hamelech. So this is an awful thing. He plundered. This is Yehoash Melech Yisrael. He plundered all the gold and all the silver and all of the kalim in the Beis Hamikdash, and he plundered all of the wealth in the king's own treasuries. V'yes b'nei hataruvos. He took the b'nei hataruvos. Now this is very, very odd. Rashi explains, who are the b'nei taruvos? So taruvos does not come from the word mixing, like Hilchos taruvos, but taruvos comes from the word arev, and that's a guarantor. And the Malachim in those days had a guarantee that the children of their closest cabinet members would actually live in the king's palace, and this was an assurance that if any of the cabinet members would revolt or rebel, it shows you how insecure people were in those days, they could hold these children as hostages and, God forbid, punish the children. Now again, to me this is very, very mudna, because the whole institution of B'nai Taruvos contradicts what the Pasuk itself says Amatzia did. It says, when Amatzia killed the people that killed his own father, he bedafka did not want to kill the children, because he wanted to be Makayim the Pasuk, Lo Yumsu Avais al Banim, Ubanim Lo Yumsu al Avais, and this was considered to be a good deed on his part. Just a few psukim later, we read that Amatzia had children that he was holding hostage in case the parents revolted. So this is a kasha, I don't have an answer, is that it seems to be from B'nai Taruvos that the children would be punished for the revolt of the parents, and that's why he held the children, even though Beferish we said Amatzia Bedafka did not do that. So that's a bit of a tzarachian, but be it as it may, when Yehoash Melech Yisrael plundered, he took the gold and the silver and the kalim from both the Beis Hamikdash and the Eitzreis Beis Hamelech. He also took the B'nai Taruvos, the children of the cabinet, as his own private avodim. Vayoshev Shemarna. So again, I don't fully understand the dynamics here. Yehoash did not conquer Malchus Yehuda. Malchus Yehuda is still intact. They are not paying a tribute, they are not subservient to Malchus Yisrael. Apparently, Yehoash was happy to plunder, take the wealth, take a few avodim, and then go back to Shomron, leaving the Malchus of Amatzia intact. Why didn't he conquer it? Could be because he understood there have to be these two kingdoms until Mashiach comes. And then, although we've already talked about Yehoash dying, but since we added stories afterwards, it repeats, Yesterday Yehoash, Asher Raso, Gvarasa, Shanilcham, Amatzia, Melech Yehuda, Halo, Haim, Kesuvim, Al Sefer Divrei Yamim Malchi Yisrael. So this is actually a repetition of a pasuk before, that all of this is described in the Divrei Hayamim Malchi Yisrael, Vayishkav Yehoash Avaisav. We already said that. Yehoash died, and he was buried in Shomron and Malchi Yisrael. And now we have the third generation from Yehu. Yehoachaz, Yehoash, and now we have Yimloch Yeravam B'nai Tachtav. He was mentioned at the end of the preceding parak as well. We now have Yeravam number 2. He's named after the founder of Malchus Yisrael. But what happened with Amatzia after this encounter? Vayechi Amatzio ben Yayash melech Yudach Rimois Yayash ben Yoachaz melech Yisrael Chamesh Esrei Shana. Amatzio melech Yehuda continued to reign after Yahayash ben Melech Yisrael died for 15 years. V'yeser divrei Amatzio Halohim Kesuvim al Sefer Divrei Hayamim L'Malcha Yehuda. And what happened to Amatzia? So again, the same thing that happened to his father. His father, Yayash, was murdered. Amatzia, although he was considered to be a tzaddik, was murdered. Vayiksheru olav kesher b'Yerushalayim. There was a revolt against him in Yerushalayim. Vayanas Lachisha. He fled Yerushalayim to go to Lachish. Vayishlechu acharav Lachisha vayimisu Hashem. And he was killed. He was assassinated in Lachish. Vayisu oso al susim. And they carried his body on horses. Vayikaver, so they brought his body back for burial. Bekavadik. Vayikaver b'Yerushalayim im avosav be'ir David. So, who is the next king after Amatzia? This is, we're talking about Malchus Yehuda. Vayikchu kol am Yehuda es Azariah. So the king was Amatzia's son, Azariah, who was relatively young. Vahu ben sheish esrei shana. Azariah was only 16 years old. V'yamlichu oso tachas oviv Amatzyahu. So both Yayash and Amatzia were victims of assassination. They were not killed by enemies. They were not killed by Malchei Yisrael. They were killed by their own servants, their own soldiers. And now we have the king Azariah, v'yamlichu oso tachas oviv Amatzia. Now Azariah is sometimes known by another name, Uzziah or Uzziyahu. So Uzziyahu HaMelech or Uzziah HaMelech or Azariah, that's the same person. And we're going to see something interesting about him. But first it gives us some of his accomplishments. Hu bana es Eilat. He built up, reconstructed Eilat. The Pashtus is that this is the Eilat of that we have even today. Vayishiveha liYehuda, and he restored it to Yehuda because it had been conquered by the Edomites and by other nations. Acharei shechav hamelech im avosav, that after his father had died, after his father Amatzia had died, Azariah was able to bring back Eilat to Eretz Yisrael. Again, interesting shaila, because many say Eilat does not have Kedushas Eretz Yisrael, and yet here we see that it was Eretz Yisrael. Question is that the same Eilat, right? So that's why you can't really prove anything from these psukim. Going back to Malchei Yisrael, again, the zigzag, I admit to you, is very, very confusing. So, Amatzia was succeeded by Azariah. Now, what happened in Malchus Yisrael? So we say, Bishnas Chamesh Esrei Shana liAmatzio ben Yayash Melech Yehuda. While Amatzia was still alive, we have the third generation of Yehu, which we've already said this 3 times. Malach Yeravam ben Yayash Melech Yisrael b'Shamron are born v'Achas Shana. So now we're going back to Yeravam II. Is the third generation from Yehu. And once again, without any exception, every single Melech Yisrael, Vayas Hara B'Einei Hashem, he did evil in the eyes of God. Loisor Mikol Chatei Yeravam ben Nevat Asher Hechti Es Yisrael. He did not depart from all of those sins of Yeravam ben Nevat to be Machti. However, he also was a conqueror who Heishev Es Gevul Yisrael Milavo Chamas Ad Yam Ha'arava, Kidvar Hashem Elokei Yisrael Asher Dibra Biyad Avdo Yona ben Amitai Hanavi Asher Migat HaChefer. Again, a very interesting pasuk that Yeravam ben Yayash was able to broaden the boundaries of the 10 tribes, the boundaries of Malchus Yisrael, from Lavo Chamat. So Mavo Chamat is a highway going to Chamat, which was a city in Syria. So the boundary extended from Lavo Chamat, which is a highway in Syria from which you get to Hamas, until the Yam HaArava, the Sea of the Plain, that's the Yam HaMelech. Now again, it's hard to understand that because certainly west of the Yam HaMelech is Malchus Yehuda. So when it says it went to the Yam HaMelech, it either means until the Yam HaMelech and not south of it, or it could mean east of the Yam HaMelech. They were able to own that territory adjacent to the Yam HaMelech. And this prophecy that Yeravam ben Yayash would be successful was a fulfillment of the prophecy of Yonah ben Amitai, a Navi who came from the town of Gas Chefer. So this is very, very fascinating. All of us know the Navi Yonah that was given a shlichus to Nineveh to bring Nineveh to tshuva and tell them that if you don't do tshuva, Nineveh is going to be destroyed. This is the Haftarah of Mincha of Yom Kippur. Yirtz Hashem, eventually in our Tanakh learning, we will come to the beautiful book of Yaina. And what happened was Nineveh did tshuva, Nineveh was not destroyed, Yaina was unhappy about it, and Hashem told him that if you have rachamim over the plants that died, Kal v'chaimer, I should have rachamim over thousands and thousands of people. But that's the only nevuah that Yaina was sent, that we know about. Here is the one other place in Tanakh where Yaina is mentioned that he gave a nevuah to or about Yeravam ben Yayash, that he would be zocheh to conquer territories in the north and add them to Eretz Yisrael that had been taken over by the Syrians or by other nations. And we are also told that Yonah ben Amitai came from a town, Gas Chefer, which was in the territory of either Yisachar or Zevulun. So we are actually given some details about Yonah that we actually do not know from the book of Yaina itself. And again, the pasuk emphasizes that Hashem had rachamim on Am Yisrael. Ki ra Hashem es ani Yisrael mayra ma'id. He saw the great affliction that the 10 tribes were suffering. V'yefes atzur, v'yefes azov. They were impoverished. They didn't have wealth that they kept in the house or wealth outside the house. Ein ozer li Yisrael. They had no source of help. V'loi diber Hashem limchos Hashem yisol mitachas hashamayim. And even though the 10 tribes deserved to be eradicated, Hashem did not want to destroy them. V'yashiyem biyad Yeravam ben Yayash. And he was able to deliver them through Yeravam ben Yayash. So again, Yayash was the one who conquered the cities that were taken by Aram. Yeravam continued that and was matzil them from other cities taken by Aram. Because remember, Yayash couldn't finish the job. He was only given 3 opportunities. Yeravam finished it. V'yeser divrei Yeravam chalasher raso gvasher shenolcham asher heishav estam mesek v'eschamas Yehuda b'Yisrael. Here it says the other exploits of Yeravam and the wars that he waged against Aram, and the fact that, amazingly enough, it says he even conquered Damascus, which became part of Eretz Yisrael, as well as Hamas. And it says, though, strangely enough, he returned them to Yehuda, which means Malchi Yehuda had conquered Hamas and Damascus. Aram took it from Malchi Yehuda, and Yeravam reconquered it and gave it back to Malchi Yehuda. Again, I don't understand the military strategies here. Why would Yeravam give it back to Malchei Yehuda instead of keeping it itself? Especially since they were waging war against Amatzia. Nevertheless, it does mention that he gave it back to Yehuda, and these are Ksuvim, al Sefer Divrei Hayamim l'Malchei Yisrael, Vayishkav Yeravam Amaisav Malchei Yisrael, and now we have the fourth generation of Yehu, Zachariah Benai Tachtav, Zachariah his son, and that will be the last generation of Yehu to be Makayim Elisha's promise, Elisha's nevuah, that to Yehu, who eradicated the house of Achav, that 4 generations will sit on the throne of Malchus Yisrael.